It's day 2 of the World Economic Forum meetings in Davos, Switzerland. This year, participants are brainstorming on the theme Rebuilding Trust in Nigeria's Trust. Nigeria's president is being represented this year by the Vice President Kashim Shetimma. Welcome to Business Edge. I'm Esther Awoni. Many thanks for joining us today. Also on the show, we'll take you through the Vice President's itinerary and what he will be telling potential investors. Also on the show today, we'll unpack Nigeria's latest inflation numbers. The month of December saw another spike in both the headline and core inflation. What does this mean for consumer spending this year? And finally, on the show, we'll shift our attention to cybersecurity and the outlook for this year. Now, experts warn that there will be an uptick this year and businesses will need to build stronger cyber resilience. Well, that's what we've got on the show today. But first, let's bring you our top business headlines from across the continent. The Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited, the NNPCL, plans to hand over the Port Harcourt oil refinery to private operators. The NNPCL is looking for reputable and credible operations and maintenance companies to run and maintain the refinery. This is to ensure reliable and sustainable fuel supply and energy security for the nation. The contract scope includes production planning, operations execution, monitoring, maintenance, health and safety, environmental management, and more. Interested companies must demonstrate a minimum annual turnover of $2 billion for the years 2019 to 2022. The NNPCL has already started supplying crude oil to the refinery for a test run, and the federal government announced the completion of rehabilitation work on the Area 5 plant of the Port Harcourt Refining Company on December 21st, 2023. Elsewhere, South African Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana played down the likelihood of accessing a 497 billion rand contingency fund held by the central bank on behalf of the country. In an interview, he stated that there is currently no deal and no pressure on either the government or the central bank to tap into the fund. The Gold and Foreign Exchange Contingency Reserve account, overseen by the central bank, contains unrealized profits or losses on reserves due to the exchange rate fluctuations, with gains or losses accruing to the government. Although the Treasury has not utilized the fund yet, discussions have taken place with the central bank and creditors regarding the optimal withdrawal amount. This money could potentially help manage debt servicing costs or address the rising state wage bill. And in Kenya, Foreign Minister Musalia Mudavadi called late Monday for the swift resolution of a diplomatic dispute over a flight banned by Tanzania on flag carrier Kenya Airways. Tanzania on Monday imposed a ban that halted passenger flights between Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, raising concerns among citizens of the two countries about escalating tensions between the East African neighbors. In discussions with Mudavadi's Tanzanian counterpart, January Makamba, the latter in a separate statement noted that both parties have come together to resolve the issue as per existing agreements within 3 days. The sudden ban arose from a disagreement over cargo flight operations. Tanzania sought approval for all cargo flights by Air Tanzania to Nairobi, but Kenyan authorities denied the request, citing technical and logistical concerns. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you up to speed on market trading at the Nigerian Exchange. Join us again. Welcome back. A quick market update. We're seeing the OSHA index at the Nigerian Exchange off to a strong start for the week, up 1.9% on Monday. Now, the local bourse began on a strong note, with the key index rising 1.92%. On Monday, market performance was driven by strong demand in Dangote Cement, Dangote Sugar, WAPCO, and Zenith Bank. Now, let's take a quick look at numbers from Monday. We're starting with the OSHA. Starting with the market capitalization, we saw that on the OSHA index up 1.92%, as I mentioned earlier, at just over 84,640 points. Over 13,000 deals were recorded at the market yesterday, while the volume also climbed into 807. Value came in at just over 11 billion. Now, market capitalization also over 11 trillion naira. Let's move on to the other numbers, looking at the sectoral performance at this time. Banking, the most sought after, most liquid and investors' favorite on the market. The banking index was up 1.3% on Monday, followed by insurance up 7.2%. So we're seeing the financial services stocks taking the lead in trading on Monday. Oil and gas index up, making a recovery from last week's losses. It's up just marginally by 0.08%. Consumer goods up 1.78%. Troubled sector, of course, we know that players in this sector continue to grapple with the high cost of credit, high cost of running the business, and of course, a shrinking consumer wallet. But analysts tell us that there is still optimism for this sector and some of the companies, some of the big names in the sector. So it's up 1.78% from yesterday. Industrial goods also up 4.4%. Yesterday. This is also a sector to watch this year. Of course, we have the industrial giants that right there in that group, and investors are always keen on those numbers, especially those with a strong dividend payout history. Well, that's it. The market is open for today already. Market started trading at around 10 a.m. this morning, and of course, we keep tracking the numbers and bring you trading as we get them. But before we go, let's just quickly take a look at some of the top gainers from yesterday. Chams up 10%. So all up 10%. That's for yesterday's, Monday's top 5 gainers. Dow Communications making a recovery from last week, actually. Accent Mansard from the insurance sector up 10%. PZ Cousins and Sovereign Insurance from the insurance sector all making it to 10% on the day. Now, for the top losers, if we could just get that up quickly. Abe takes the top spot, down 9.5%. Julius Berger also making a loss there yesterday, down 3.5%. We have Custodian, AfriPrud, and FBN Holdings from the banking sector, down 1.8% at 27.50 kobo per share. But that's a wrap on the market review for what trading looked like on Monday. We'll take a break at this time, and when we come back, we'll continue with the rest of the show. Welcome back. Another year, another World Economic Forum. Of course, we're looking at the theme for this year, which is rebuilding trust. Nigeria's Vice President, Kashim Shetimma, who will be representing President Bola Tinubu, is attending the forum alongside other top world leaders, such as French President Emmanuel Macron, Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky, and Li Qiang, Premier of the People's Republic of China. Now, Nigeria's Vice President, who will be representing President Bola Tinubu, like I said, is attending the forum alongside other top world leaders, such as President Macron, Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky, and the Premier of the People's Republic of China. Also, an estimated 1,600 business leaders, including 800 plus of the world's top CEOs, will participate this year. So what is on the agenda this year? Now, leaders will concentrate on 6 critical themes. That's economic resilience, energy transformation, globalization, productive artificial intelligence, strengthening institutions, and women's health. Now, last year in Davos, the word polycrisis was a buzzword as leaders deliberated the cascading and connected crises of the moment. But today, the world contends with additional layers of crises, and the old ones also persist, sadly. In the words of Boris Brand, the president of the World Economic Forum, he's asking the question to leaders. He says, at Davos 2024, will this year be a period of perma-crisis, he says, or will 2024 be a time for resolution, resilience, and recovery? certainly something for leaders to think about while in Davos. Now, let's shift our focus to Nigeria's vice president and his itinerary for this year's event. Well, he's expected there will be a country strategy dialogue on Nigeria. Now, this is a roundtable discussion that will be chaired by the vice president. And now 60 global CEOs and chairs are expected to participate. Now, he's also expected at that time to also speak to these private investors, selling Nigeria's value proposition to those investors. We know that the vice president is also on a mission to increase foreign direct investment by wooing these investors, of course, sharing with them the hope agenda of the Tinubu administration to woo investors to critical sectors of the economy, particularly in industry, agriculture, and also ICT. Let's move this along. He will also be attending a stakeholder dialogue with the theme Transforming Energy Demand to discuss what companies and governments can do to boost economic growth with less energy. And the Vice President will also meet James Quincy, Global Executive Chief Officer of Coca-Cola. I think that is one also to watch out for. We'll give you details as we get them. The Vice President is also scheduled to have a private breakfast titled Driving Action under the African Continental Free Trade Area. Now, this is very critical. We know that the African Continental Free Trade Area agreement is over 5 years old right now, but inter-African trade remains below 20%. African countries, not enough African countries are trading amongst themselves. Nigeria's biggest partners are not on the African continent. So this is a discussion that the Vice President will be having at this breakfast meeting to see how there can be more African collaboration, especially in the area of trade, bringing down those barriers that prevent people, goods, and services from moving freely across the continent. And moving on, his engagement is also expected to end with a private dinner with some dignitaries who will include the heads of state, international organizations, and strategic partners. According to Nigeria's Foreign Affairs Minister, as I mentioned earlier, Nigeria's participation at WEF provides an opportunity for the Vice President to woo foreign investors. That's the official statement from the presidency. We will be keeping an eye on WEF proceedings as the days go ahead. It's day 2 of the forum. Participants will be brainstorming on the theme Rebuilding Trust. Now, this is all happening in the backdrop of the global crises, the Hamas-Israel war. We're seeing AI taking up, affecting negatively the employment market, etc. So those are some of the themes that we will be tracking as WEF progresses for the rest of the week. Now let's move on to our next conversation, and that is looking at inflation. Nigeria's inflation rate rose to 28.9% in the month of December. We saw. Now, this is it's climbed for the 11th month in a row, reaching a painful 28.9%. Let's take, in December, we did see food inflation also a major contributor to inflation numbers. Let's get our guest in to discuss some of the numbers.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Esther. So it's actually not something that was much of a surprise, seeing this increase, because to be quite honest with you, December had its own activities, and we had seen a lot of policies that took place in the year 2023, which would actually speak to some of those increases, right? The factors responsible for those increases. So if you consider the fact that the fuel subsidy was removed in the month of May, if you consider that even how we started 2023, we had the issue with the cash crunch, and which was also the way we ended it, right? So a lot of these things were responsible for the increase in prices, and finally the festivities which we saw. So it wasn't something different from what was expected, right? So on a year-on-year basis, you like you rightly said, it actually increased from about 28.2% to as high as 28.9%, right? Then if you then consider it on a month-on-month basis, there was that increase by about 2%. Now, one interesting thing, Esther, is that when we started the year, inflation was trending in the month of January 2023 at somewhere around 21%. It ended at 28.9%. If I compare this to neighboring countries, and inflation across the world, right, is actually on a decline in most nations of the world. It's actually trending downwards. I looked at Ghana's figure. Ghana's figure was somewhere within the range of 51% in January. And as of December, Ghana's figure is currently somewhere at 23%. So they have done well, right? The policy measures that have been taken by their authorities, we've started to see the impact, but Nigeria seems to be an outlier in this instance. So I'll stop at that point for my introduction.
But I wanted to also get your thoughts on core inflation, of course, excluding the volatile food and transportation elements of headline inflation. That also saw an uptick, and that is also a number that we should also be watching keenly. What are your thoughts in terms of core inflation, the movement, and what your forecast is in terms of when there could possibly be a tapering?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So core inflation, like you said, you have taken out the items that can lead to volatilities, right, such as food, right? So for other items, the reason why we saw those increase, right? If you consider the fact that most of the products that we consume in Nigeria are also imports, right? We depend a lot on imports, right? They're import related. So you see a situation whereby there was the pass-through effect of the exchange rate. So that was one of the reasons that we can attribute to it. Then also, if you consider the fact that transport, you want to look at transport logistics, these are also issues that will definitely feed into price. So these structural issues that we have in the country are some of the reasons why we encounter that increase in prices. And let's not forget, if you also look at some of the items that have to do with medicine, for instance, if you remember, the exit of the pharmaceutical company GlaxoSmithKline actually saw the price of most of these medical products and goods spike, right, increase to record highs never seen previously, right? So these are some of the things that led to that increase that we have. Energy costs, they've actually been on the decline globally, but yet it's still not reflecting in our inflation figures. So these are some of the things that are responsible. And let's not also forget that we've also seen a situation whereby our money supply has actually been going higher than even the GDP growth, right? And if you look at the basic definition of inflation, inflation is a situation whereby you have lots of money chasing after few goods, right? With some of the ways and means that we've seen, and governments borrowing a lot of money without any corresponding productivity to back it up, we've definitely seen an increase in money supply. And these are some of the things that have given rise to even an increase in core inflation.
Now, right, Kayode, bringing this down to a more granular level, I mean, what the average Nigerian is concerned about is how this affects, how this affects their pocket, how this affects their spending power. Now, we have seen that consist over the last several months now. You go to the market or supermarket or wherever 1 week, and 3 weeks later, you go back to that same place to buy that same item. But then there's been an increase, and it's been on the minds of everyone. It's dominating conversations across the country. Why do the price of food items continue to go high? Now, you and I know the answer to that, but another question that's being asked is, what are the authorities doing about it? What is the plan to ensure that the price inflation is reined in? We saw what Ghana did, painful steps taken, but they were able to bring it down from somewhere around 50% to somewhere around 20 or 30 plus percent at this point. So talk to us, what is the plan of the government to bring down inflation in the manner that we will see will begin to impact on the spending power of the average Nigerian?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Esther, for that question. So, if you consider the first comment you made, right, the impact of inflation, firstly, like you said, is that it reduces the purchasing power of individuals, the spending power. So invariably, Nigerians are poorer, right, as at the end of December 2023 compared to where they were coming from in January 2023, right? And like you rightly said, if you go to most of these, if you go to shops, you see that prices have gone on the increase. So basically, one thing that we must say is that Nigeria, we import a lot, right? Most of those items that we see are items that were imported, even though in honesty, you see individuals who have probably have those goods in their stock, they still complain about the price being increasing as a result of the need for dollar, right? So that issue of the removal of subsidy as well as the unification of the exchange rate both on the 29th of May and the 14th of June, were things that have caused this increase. And like the current administration have said, these are painful measures that need to be put in place, right, with the expectation that things would get better in the future, right? So with respect to what the government is doing right now, I think some of the measures the government has put in place, such as the removal of VAT on liquefied petroleum gas, which is the cooking gas, right? And also some of the initiatives that has to do with the inauguration of the bus system, the mass transit system that runs with compressed natural gas. And this is a good initiative, and it's being done to ease the increase in cost with respect to transportation. And I think a good move that the government also puts in place was that reduction of cost with respect to traveling that took place, if you remember, in the month of December. I think those were good initiatives. And I know the question will be, what is the government doing going forward? So I think some of the what do I call it now? Some of the initiatives that we've seen, such as this 500,000 hectare cultivation of land that the government is currently initiating in the northern region of the country. I think it's a good initiative in such a way that you are trying to promote food production, because the bulk of that inflation that we're currently seeing is coming as a result of food inflation. So if government is able to promote and encourage the increase in food supply, that will to a large extent bring down the prices. Then also we talked about the we talked about transporting those items from where they are being produced to where they are being consumed, right? The cost of transportation, as long as the government is able to ease this burden, it will to a large extent also reduce the price of these food items. And I think a good thing, or a good news that we can celebrate, is the opening of the Dangote refinery, right, which has started production of diesel. Now, most of these transport vehicles that are used to bring food from the food basket regions to these the regions where we consume them, they run on diesel, right? So Dangote's production would actually ease the price. When I say easing the price, not necessarily in terms of the basic price of the product itself, but in terms of the landing cost, right? Because we don't have to import it.
Kayode, if I
Right.
could
So I
just
think
jump in
these
here.
initiatives would help.
I do beg your pardon. If I could just jump in here, just trying to move this conversation along. Now, you made a very good point when you mentioned that food inflation, of course, we know is the biggest driver in terms of the inflation spike we continue to see. But another part of, and you also talked about the fact that yes, if we could address logistics issues, with diesel for the trucks and all of that, definitely. But another part of this story is local manufacturers themselves, those who do not even produce food. We know that Nigeria has a high import bill, and which we know that obviously one of the reasons why we're having that dollar shortage. But the question is, or the issue is, many of these local manufacturers are not able to operate in a competitive manner because many of these goods that are brought into the country are better quality. And as a consumer, consumers want, they want quality for every naira that they spend. So for the local manufacturers themselves, cost of credit is high, 30% plus. We know that the reason or the way the monetary authorities are going to fight inflation this year is to then also increase that same interest rate, so we're having that cycle of the local manufacturers unable to be competitive with what they produce and their whole cost of production. And we have the monetary authorities, on the other hand, still raising interest rate, making it even further more difficult for these manufacturers. So what could be a win-win situation? We know the responsibility of the monetary authorities as regards inflation, but that is being done at the expense of growth. If we cannot get our local manufacturers to operate in a competitive manner where when we go to the supermarket or store, wherever we see locally made products, we are unable to buy because one, they're sometimes even more expensive and of lower quality because they have to cut corners, because they have that high overhead, they have to pay for diesel, their own power, etc. It's just a cycle that keeps going round and round. How can we break this?
Yeah, thanks, Esther. That's a good one. So it's actually a big problem, like you rightly said, because if you look at manufacturing is quite key if we are looking at economic development, right? And given the fact that the federal government has set its target to raise the economy to a 1 trillion economy by 2030. So manufacturing is actually quite key. So like you said, the challenges that are faced by manufacturers, one of them has to do with the challenge of access to exchange rates, right? Forex, and also the challenge of the cost of production here locally. So I think one thing that is quite important, because if you consider the fact that the CBN is dealing with inflation from the monetary angle, you would also expect the fiscal authorities, that's the government, to also assist in putting in place a kind of an enabling environment, right, that promotes doing business in the country. So I think one key thing is infrastructure. We've talked about it so many times, and we know that different organizations have been set up, or different investment vehicles have been set up to promote the growth of infrastructure in the country. Given the fact that Nigeria currently has a huge infrastructural deficit, and it's expected that we should be spending as high as $100 billion per annum with respect to infrastructure. I think one key thing that the government needs to do, which it's currently doing, is to promote investments in that space. So you see a situation whereby the president has traveled to different countries, Germany, spoken with the German chancellor with respect to the Siemens power project deal. I think even going beyond that is also to look at local investors, right? Public-private partnerships, right? Because if you consider the fact that electricity is one aspect of our infrastructure, power, that has actually suffered. And there is a popular saying that where there is no power, things fall apart, right? And even the government himself, the president said it in his speech on the 4th of January this year, that he does recognize that there can be no meaningful economic transformation without a steady electricity supply. So I think one key thing that the government needs to do to ensure that our manufacturers are competitive is to solve that issue of power, right? Because if they're able to do that, there would be no need to rely heavily on diesel or alternative sources, right? Then I also think that it's important to, like I said, there's a need for the private sector to also come in to actually support with respect to local investments being made. Then I also think one other key thing that the government needs to do in order to promote ease of doing business is to look at some of the MDAs, some of the regulators that give approvals, because some of the issues that they also face have to do with regulatory approvals, whereby there is this bureaucracy, or whereby even the MDA, the agencies are not in sync with the government's agenda. So I think if the government is able to deal with the attitude of agencies itself, this can also go a long way in supporting competitiveness.
Thank you so much, Kayode, for talking to us today. We appreciate your time on the show. That was Abiodun Kayode Ali, economist and senior manager at PwC Nigeria, unpacking Nigeria's latest inflation numbers. We saw another uptick in the month of December. We'll take a quick break, and we'll be right back with the rest of the show. Do join us again. Welcome back. On to our next conversation. The African continent has had a number of external and internal shocks in its micro and macroeconomic realities in 2023. And these have continued to affect the continent's viability and even investment prospects into 2024. Despite these myriad of geopolitical external factors which have impacted Africa negatively, the continental Africa's growth narrative is multifaceted, defying the notion of a monolithic one Africa. Joining me on the show for this conversation is Dumebi Oluwole, senior economist at STERS. Dumebi, thank you for joining us today. Let's get right to it. Africa's projected growth rate, according to the IMF, is about 4% this year, up from 3.3% in 2023, the second highest growth rate in the world, behind Asia's 4.8%. What sectors do you see adding to this projection? Could you just unmute your mic, please?
Yes, sure. Thank you for having me on the show, and I did hear a question. So definitely it's more about the countries driving the growth than the sectors. And the reason why we say this is because we try not to look at Africa as a country and consider the unique characteristics and policies that, play out in various economies before looking at their entire effect or their looped effect on the entire continent. So for Africa's GDP growth, we're seeing very bright spots in the East Africa community, and the drivers of growth in that region remain Rwanda, Kenya, Tanzania, and to some extent Uganda. And the reason we're projecting that those countries would remain positive and continue to have stellar growth in 2024 is because of the tourism sector. So that sector has continually supported those economies significantly, and we expect that trend to continue in 2024, simply because the global economy is rebounding and we're seeing more tourist activities. In addition, we're also seeing the governments of these countries take more significant approaches, and they're being more intentional about the real sectors of their economy. For instance, in Kenya, agriculture is a very significant sector for the economy, and we're seeing the government really harness the special economic zones, or try to harness the special economic zones and generate more output. In terms of the other regions in the continent that are also prospective bright spots, we're seeing green lights from the Central African region with specific focus on specific focus on Ivory Coast. Ivory Coast right now is expected to grow by above 6%, which is significantly higher than the global GDP forecast of about 5.8%, and the entire continent's forecast of about 3 to 4%. And the growth in Ivory Coast will significantly be engineered by the value addition in its agricultural sector, specifically for cocoa and cashew. And we're also seeing an increase in FDI inflows to Ivory Coast and generally the Central African region. I think another bright spot is Mozambique, and this is because of investments in its LNG sector. And we're going to see that, significantly pick up in 2024.
And maybe it's very encouraging to hear, you talk about those bright spots. But we do know that, especially from a fiscal side of things, many African budgets are constrained. Right from the last couple of years, many were seen paying more to service their debt. Nigeria is one of them. Their concerns, even the World Bank, the IMF, even the African Development Bank have all said that, look, the cost of servicing this debt for these African countries continues to rise. Now, we know that, of course, the G20, IMF's, the World Bank's G20 framework for debt treatment is meant to address some of these issues. We're seeing Ghana doing that with bilateral creditors. They've been able to reach some kind of an agreement, but that could potentially, or let me ask, could that potentially be a big issue in terms of how these countries move forward with infrastructure development and just making the overall, improving the overall well-being of their citizens?
Yeah, it is definitely a threat and a very huge risk, considering that global interest rates are still not projected to decline significantly to near zero, which was where the world was coming from 2021. Interest rates are still high, and there's still the Africa risk premium attached to global investments, especially when African countries tend to venture into the international debt market or international capital market. But to be very fair, we're also seeing debt restructuring conversations happen. We've seen that come to light with Ghana. We're also seeing increased funding towards these bright spots from bilateral institutions and multilateral institutions like the Trade Development Bank, the World Bank, and even the IMF. A very key example is Kenya, simply because they're sticking to the reforms and doing what needs to be done to significantly boost government revenue, meet its debt obligations, and revamp or resuscitate its economy. Was seeing support from the IMF, the World Bank, and other bilateral creditors. We're also even seeing China somewhat come to the table to support African countries that have continue to default on their loans, or their prospects for them defaulting on their loans, just to generally ease the debt burden, considering that global interest rates are significantly higher than where they were before. So while it is still a threat or a possible risk, we're also seeing African countries become more fiscally prudent, take up IMF reforms, and generally be more conservative with how they're spending, and incentivize or encourage investor confidence so that they continue to generate more of these dollar inflows. So we would likely see that continue, the debt restructuring conversations, IMF support, more countries trying to take up IMF programs simply because because they're trying to attract funding. We've also seen a country like Ivory Coast, which is a bright spot for Africa this year, trying to issue a Eurobond in 2024, and that would be the first Eurobond issuance in the last 2 years. And we just expect more positive feedback from the international community. And I think another thing that's supporting this somewhat optimistic debt outlook for the African continent is because global interest rates are also expected to somewhat taper towards the second half of the year or even by year end. And this might, encourage investors to rebalance their portfolio in favor of emerging markets that would still remain hawkish to catch up with the global economy.
All right, Dumebi, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for talking to us today. We appreciate your time on the show today. That was Dumebi from STARS. We'll take a short break and we'll be right back with the rest of the show. Do join us again. Welcome back. The cybersecurity economy grew exponentially faster than the overall global economy in 2023, and a stark divide between cyber-resilient organizations and those that are struggling has emerged. But this is according to the World Economic Forum's Global Cybersecurity Outlook, which also highlights the key cyber trends that executives will need to navigate this year. Now, how can businesses build stronger cyber resilience in 2024? Sylvia Brun, CEO PowerPass, joins us now for this discussion. Sylvia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, let's get right to it. What major gains did the African companies record in their quest to boost cyber resilience, and what were the key factors that led to a stronger cyber resilience in 2023?
So I think that the main kind of impetus to increasing, just cyber awareness in general is when something happens. When bad things happen, then companies get more aware of and need to tackle those things. And coming off of COVID, where there was a huge amount of new users doing things online, companies working remotely, there was a big shot up in the number of fraud that online businesses experienced. And this, of course, fed into companies understanding, okay, we need to step up our game, and led to a lot of the gains in 2023.
All right, let's move this along. The World Economic Forum, in its 2024 Cybersecurity Outlook, says there is a growing divide between cyber-resilient companies and those that are not. It says that this is emerging. Could you speak to this point and how cyber inequality is impacting on businesses?
Yeah, I think it's a bit ambiguous how they define a non-resilient business, because it's businesses that self-profess themselves to be not resilient. And obviously, large organizations are going to be targeted a lot more than small organizations. So they are going to beef up their controls and their systems and their internal education. Whereas a lot of small companies just won't be targeted because there needs to be a sufficient gain for attackers to want to, derive some kind of benefit from it. So if you haven't been attacked, you probably aren't building up those. Not to say that you shouldn't. You should obviously be ahead of the game. I'm just saying that, the growing divide, I think, is a bit, let's say, dramatic. I did see in the report, they said there was a growing divide between emerging markets and developing markets. And this, of course, is definitely the case. I think that, we work a lot in Africa. So what we see is that if your users don't generate a lot of profit, if you have very small margins you're operating within, you're not going to spend a lot of resources in, the newest technologies and, the best experts, et cetera, in order to beef up your cybersecurity controls. And there's always going to be that trade-off, like how much do you want to invest in that versus how much, do you need to have a sustainable business? And I think that it's, from our customers, it's not only the cost, it's also like how much trouble do you want to put your users through? Because you already have users that are not, let's say, the most digital savvy, and they are operating on lower internet band rates. They're operating on lower end smartphones. It is already extremely challenging to provide a smooth user experience that is convenient for them. And so how much do you want to disrupt that experience by putting extra controls and extra steps in for those users? And you may lose users. Like if you make passwords extremely complicated, then that's really great for cybersecurity. But then maybe you have, half your users forgetting their passwords and not being able to reset their passwords, exposing them to other kinds of risks. So there are these trade-offs that I think it's not just a cut and clean kind of, oh, there's a big divide in the cybersecurity world.
Right. I'm curious about regulatory technology. Talk to us about how widespread its usage is and its importance in facilitating complex compliance in complex regulatory environments.
So from what we've seen so far, I mean, most businesses to some lower or higher degree use a lot of manual steps in their compliance, in their user verification, in their fraud controls. It's still highly manual. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think you do need to have a certain degree of, let's say, people involved who understand what's going on. You can't just automate everything because then you don't learn. And because the risks are changing all the time, you do need people in there that are constantly aware of what's going on. It's not just like a switch, like, oh, now I can put in some, compliance or regulatory technology, and then it's going to take care of itself. That's not how it's gonna fly. And so I do see that there is maybe too much manual work that could be automated and that could complement the manual labor to a much higher degree. Yeah.
Well, I guess that takes me to my next question, and that's about the cyber skills gap, which experts say will continue to widen in 2024, and a talent shortage in the industry. Why does this problem continue to persist, and how can it be better addressed?
Yeah, so I think that education is definitely a problem. And I think that it's not just, if you get someone in a room and then, quiet space for 10 minutes and you ask them questions about cybersecurity and best practice, I think most people will give you great answers. I think the problem happens when you're juggling a lot of things, you're running late to an appointment, you have 5 emails plinging, and then all of a sudden someone calls and say, hey, you just got an OTP, give that to me so that I can quickly put that in and you can get access to this, event or whatever. People are caught off guard. I think even the most intelligent people will be caught off guard in certain times of stress. And so I think, one company that we worked with, they did something fun where they started sending out phishing emails to their own employees just to gauge kind of how switched on people were. And then people who weren't switched on, they can get some extra training. So I think that it's not necessarily, the high-skilled cyber expert training that is the big problem. I think like the day-to-day training of regular staff, of support staff, how are we educating our customers? What kind of people, what kind of questions are we asking our customers? What kind of data are we asking them to provide? Do they know which data we will never ask them to provide? And how do you deal with edge cases? And there's a lot of this kind of low-hanging fruit, I think, that is possible to achieve, and it's possible to understand that it's not necessarily people who are, always trying to defraud you. Sometimes it's just people who are unaware or caught off guard. And this I think is a big risk. Internal fraud is a huge risk. Collaboration between internal staff and external, whether aware or unaware. These are big challenges, and it's not about just educating a cyber skills expert, which by the way, this is a very new field. I don't think you're going to see many of them in the next 5
Right.
to 10 years. It's still an evolving sport with evolving risks, and it will take some time to get those on board and those skilled. And in the meantime, I think it's about really taking those low-hanging fruit training sessions, awareness sessions to staff and also to customers.
Right. Thank you so much, Sylvia. We'll leave it there. Hopefully, the industry will see a better year compared to 2023. Well, that was Sylvia Brun, CEO PowerPass. So that's it on this edition of Business Edge. Follow us on social media. We're News Central TV. Head to our website, newscentral.africa, and download our mobile app on Play Store and App Store. Till next time, I'm Esther Awuni. Bye for now.